Hey everyone, my name is Deanna and I am completely obsessed with startups and the amazing things that go on behind the scenes to make them successful. In today's episode of Studio Upstart, we're going to take a look at the business model behind startup studios. We're going to use an awesome visual tool called the Business Model Canvas to do this. The Business Model Canvas was developed by Alexander Osterwalder and a couple other strategic advisors, and it became a wild hit with entrepreneurs and investors after it was crafted into a book called The Business Model Generation. This is one of my absolute favorite books. I go back to it all the time when I'm working with my clients. It lays out, it helps you walk through all the stages of your business model, but first it lays out what exactly the Business Model Canvas is, and it looks like this, just as a precursor to what we're gonna do in this video. So, it helps entrepreneurs see how one area of the business model influences and impacts other areas of the business model, and it helps them plan their business all at once. So, in this episode, I am going to give you a quick overview of this very powerful tool, and then I'm going to break it down section by section for an actual startup studio. So we're going to do a little use case. So let's jump in. I wrote an article not too long ago about the 9 building blocks of the Business Model Canvas, and in the description below this video, I've put a link to that. If this overview is too high level, feel free to check out that article and get a more in-depth understanding of the Business Model Canvas. This is what the Business Model Canvas looks like. It has 9 parts, and personally, I like to look at it from right to left. Beginning with customer segments, I move on to channels, then to customer relationships, then to value propositions, then to key activities, then to key resources, and then to key partners, then on to revenue streams, and finally, I design the cost structure. I like to do it this way because knowing who your customers are help you understand how you'll reach them when you have to access your channels, which help inform the type of relationship you need to have with them, which then influences what you need to offer them to keep them happy. And this helps you map out the activities that will go into producing your value proposition, which helps you understand what resources you need to secure in order to complete these activities. And that helps you define the kinds of outside partnerships you need to have in place. The revenue stream you come up with will be a result of what and how you sell your product or your service to your customers, and the cost structure is determined by the types of resources you will need to be successful. So, these are the 9 parts of the Business Model Canvas. So now that you have an understanding of the canvas, let's dive into the startup studio model. And if you're not sure what a startup studio is, or you need a refresher on the type of businesses that startup studios operate within, feel free to go back and watch any of my earlier videos. I recommend episode 1, what is the startup studio business model. It doesn't get as in-depth as I'm going to get here, but it's a very good overview. At the most basic level, the goal of a startup studio is to create startups in parallel or one right after the other and get them to the point of market traction. Once a viable business is established, the studio spins out the venture, handing it off to an outside team that they've recruited and put together, and then the core internal team of the studio goes back to work building their next startup. Let's begin with customer segments. For startup studios, the populations you're serving consist of entrepreneurs who will work with and for the studio, and investors and other stakeholders who will help with operations and funding. I decided on a niche market approach because while the variety of customers a studio will serve is wide-ranging, they do all have very specific focuses and tend to operate within the same innovation sphere. Next, let's take a look at channels. To develop and maintain a strong network of entrepreneurs, a startup studio needs to put a lot of effort into being active on social media sites like LinkedIn and Twitter, and they need to find and connect with investors. The studio, might be diligent with outreach, both online and offline, on sites like AngelList and offline and traditional networking venues. But other channels of importance for startup studios are university-based career centers and innovation-specific membership networks like Startup Grind, GSSN, and Thai Angels. The 2 questions you need to ask here are, how will I reach my customers and how will I engage with them? To be clear, this block should include specifics about which online or offline channels you plan to use. And in order for you to get in front of your customers, you'll need to create, content for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or are you going to hang flyers around a campus? Like this block is specifically focused on how you're going to reach your customers and how are you going to engage with them. Will it be mostly online? Will it be mostly in person? Certain services do better with an in-person touch, like a tax and legal help. Others thrive on using online chatbots for automation. So that's what you need to figure out. So startup studios are more hands-on than many other types of businesses today because of the fact that the studio team isn't just building one venture. The internal team would ideally like to work in the same space or at least in the same time zone in order to ensure a clear understanding of objectives and goals. When it comes to customer interaction, the first point of contact is likely going to be one of the channels we discussed earlier or an introduction through a personal relationship. And once the studio team is connected with an entrepreneur or an investor or an innovation program, the follow-up relationship is usually one that's pretty personal in nature and customized to the customer's current goals. I've outlined the value proposition for our two main customer segments, entrepreneurs and investors. When I say entrepreneurs here, I'm talking about the team that will come in after the startup has been built. These individuals are looking to take over a startup when there is a clear go-to-market strategy, it's outlined, the connections to the market are there, key stakeholders have already been established, and for investors, the value really lies in working with a core internal team that's able to repeatedly execute on ideas and bring new startups to market with a proven process. They care more about lowering their risk than anything else. So that's the value that comes from investing in a startup studio rather than investing in new startups individually. Moving on to the key activities block, we get into the details a bit. There are three main activities that I've identified as the most important for the success of a startup studio, and these are execution, operations, and fundraising. Execution activities are like market research, viability testing, and project work. These all kind of lead to the eventual spin out of the project and thus are critical. Operationally, studios have a lot of recruiting work to do. They must get entrepreneurs to join the studio as part of the core team. They have to recruit entrepreneurs to run the spin-off projects, and they have to find smart, startup educated, legal and financial professionals to help out with the behind the scenes work. They also must be heavily involved in fundraising from investors to help fund the studio and the subsequent startups that are launched from the studio. When we look at the key resources block, we need to ensure that we're putting all of the foundational pieces in place to make the studio work. This includes human capital, like entrepreneurs, investors, a board of directors and advisors. Financial capital includes, funds to fund the studio, salaries for the employees, and then other resources like access to lawyers and operational resources like office space and equipment and hardware and software and online retail space and social media presences. And all these resources are required to launch and execute on startup ideas. These are what we need to focus on with the resources component of the startup studio. Startup studios require a lot of partnerships. First and foremost, they need partnerships with investors to get the studio started and running smoothly. Beyond that, universities, innovation programs like startup accelerators and incubators, and corporations all provide the talent necessary to build the network required to make a studio a success. Additionally, partnerships with co-working and event spaces are going to come in very handy as studios begin to expand their operations. The cost structure should be directly driven by the studio's key activities. When your studio team answers the question, what do we need to do to operate this studio and build startups within it, you should list the costs associated with each of those activities. For starters, the entrepreneurs working full-time within the studio deserve the benefits of a traditional full-time job. That means salary and health insurance. Beyond that, there are costs for space, marketing, recruitment, sales, and a lot of costs associated with building the actual startup ventures. The final piece of the business model canvas is the revenue streams block. So this is the hardest block for some entrepreneurs to nail down, but in my opinion, it's the most important. You have to have a financial plan for any venture, even if it's a venture with the sole purpose of making other ventures. How are you going to make money? keep in mind that investment from investors is not revenue, that's investment. So how are you going to profit? That is the goal of the revenue streams block. The obvious answer here is to make a profit from the success of the startups that come out of the studio. This is the best case scenario, but since the studio holds the majority of the equity from each startup, another viable revenue model is to profit from the sale, merger, or acquisition of a startup. This is what happened in July of 2015 when startup studio spinoff Dollar Shave Club was acquired by Unilever for $1 billion cash. Other ways to make money from a startup studio model include hosting events, putting on workshops, and obtaining sponsorships from organizations looking to further the innovation sector. Here is a look at the full startup studio business model canvas as I've just laid it out. Using this one-page tool, you can work with your team to design a game plan holistically rather than taking each section one by one and developing them in silos. You and your team will be able to clearly see where one element is impacting another, and you can even draw arrows to and from the points that relate, like recruiting and key activities and recruiting expenses in the cost structure section. So the business model canvas is a tool that I use to start all of my projects off with, because in the business that I work with, it's new founders that are just getting their startups launched, and they often come from deep tech or tech industry backgrounds and don't have a solid understanding of the foundational elements of startup development. And this allows me to walk them through all the 9 sections of a business model without overwhelming them or confusing them. So I've put a link to a blank version of the business model canvas in the description below. If you're interested, though, in taking the Canvas digital, I recommend you check out Miro.com. They've made it pretty easy to design operations using a ton of visual planning boards. So that's it for me today, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and if you learned something new today, please hit the subscribe button and tap the bell to get notified when I release the next video in this series. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.